Atheist-based Patreon project presents LackTheism. Scary sounding. LackTheism. What's it mean? Well, there's some dispute about how best to define or describe atheism. And so there's a number of different labels that get used and definitions that get used. And one of them is that at a minimum, in a technical sense, atheists are people who lack a belief in a God.
Okay, so far I disagree here.
And I know some people, and I've had arguments with people, I've had discussions with people. I know some atheists who hate that term. It's a big pet peeve for them. It's a problem. And in talking to at least one of them, but I've talked to several others as well.
First flaw. This is an argument from your personal experience. Also a red herring fallacy. The topic is not about your personal experience or what other atheists believe.
The concern seems to be that atheism is a considered position and an active rejection of a theistic claim. And I don't think, and I agree, that when I talk about atheism in the sense of me, I'm an atheist. I think my position is a considered position, and it's an active rejection, and it's still true that I lack theism. I lack a belief that there truly is a God.
I disagree with lacking theism. It would be denying theism. I agree that atheism is a considered position since it has propositional values. Also agree that it is an active rejection. But you can't reject atheism and also lack it.
So for clarity, here's a quick rundown. I have, in fact, considered theistic claims, but I haven't considered all of them.
Yeah, I haven't either.
And so a sort of universal declaration that all gods are false is not warranted because I neither have knowledge of all the God claims nor have knowledge that they are all necessarily false.
You have introduced a red herring. You went from LackTheism in a technical sense, then change it to your personal epistemic stance. I don't think you need to go over every single claim of each specific God to show it's false. There's other ways to go about this. You just need to have a worldview that gives an account for metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Also, if you could disprove part of deism, then all other beliefs in theism would be false automatically, since they are sub-theories of deism. It's called modified deism, a philosophical position that accepts the core deistic premise of an uncaused, immaterial first cause or principle, but doesn't accept the other premises.
Some of them are unfalsifiable, and by that very fact, it would be a mistake to say that they're false.
How do you know they're unfalsifiable, and what standard of evidence are you holding this to?
And it would also be a mistake to say that you have good reason to think they're true and unfalsifiable.
Again, what is your justification for your claim? If some of the gods are purely described as material and not immaterial, then those ones wouldn't actually be unfalsifiable. If the gods are described as immaterial, though, then yes, it's unfalsifiable by empirical evidence. But you then would give an immaterial account for this, which is a metaphysical view.
Proposition is useless.
I disagree. It's only useless when you apply it in the way you did.
But I have considered the claims, and I have actively rejected all of them, which does not mean that I assert that they are false or accept that they are false.
You just said you actively reject all of them, and then said this doesn't mean I assert they are all false or accept they are all false. I agree that you didn't assert they were all false, but you said you accept and don't accept they're all false. This is a contradiction.
As I just mentioned, some of them are unfalsifiable.
Just because something is unfalsifiable doesn't mean it can't be shown to be false. You could show it has a logical contradiction, but again, it's unfalsifiable by empirical evidence.
So it would be silly to think that. It merely means I reject the claim that they are in fact true, or that it is warranted to believe that they are true. I actively reject the proposition, it is true that some God exists. That doesn't mean I accept the opposite.
You are technically accepting the opposite by a psychological report on the evidence. And also, even knowledge claims are propositional claims. They are just ones that are about someone's state of mind and don't need to be defended in the same way an objective claim about reality needs to be defended.
And the example that we've used many times is the difference between guilty, innocent, and not guilty. Well, if you're in a courtroom, in the United States at least, all people are innocent until proven guilty, but the jury tends to not vote guilty or innocent. They tend to vote guilty or not guilty. And what it does is it establishes that the burden of proof is on the claimant that says you are guilty, and that until they meet that burden of proof, all of us should lack belief that the defendant is guilty.
This is a red herring fallacy. Your original argument was not about the burden of proof, but about your personal belief. A legal verdict of not guilty does not require the jury to suspend judgment or refrain from having a personal opinion about the defendant's guilt. The jury's duty is only to decide if the evidence was sufficient.
And that's why we say not guilty. It does not mean that we should all believe they are innocent. It means we should act and treat them as if they are innocent until guilt has been established. It's setting up a default position. And also to expand this just to atheism.
This has nothing to do with your argument. Still, let's stay on point. This is a procedural rule in the legal system about the burden of proof. Different from private beliefs when you earlier said you actively rejected all of them. Sure, the legal position is non-neutral and the philosophical position is non-neutral as well. The legal system one is about the evidence's inadequacy, which forces a legal outcome. But Matt Dillahunty made an active rejection. It wasn't about the evidence in the same way a legal system was, but it was an eternal verdict.
I should live my life and act as if there are no gods until such time as it's established that one or more gods actually exist.
This is a red herring fallacy to distract from his eternal burden. The core argument here is if his statement, I actively reject all claims but do not accept them as false, is logically consistent. He introduced a new argument. I should live my life as if there are no gods. He has switched the topic from the philosophical critique of his belief state, the burden of coherence, to the inaccessible principle of epistemic default. The burden of proof is on the claimant. Seems like he's saying, I don't have to defend my contradiction. I just have to follow the rule that the theist must prove their case. It is a distraction because the valid rule of the burden of proof cannot logically justify his contradictory, non-neutral act of rejection.
Because it's just a distraction and a shifting of the burden of proof. But lack can also be used as a pejorative. By and large, I don't think most people would say, I lack cancer. But they might say I'm cancer-free or I don't have cancer. And in a technical distinction, I don't have cancer and I lack cancer are co-equal.
This third one is a red herring fallacy. It changes the topic from even the other red herring fallacy. Now he is committing equivocation by comparing lack of belief in epistemic state with the lack of cancer, a biological fact. The analogy fails because the existence of cancer is material and empirically verifiable, making lack of cancer co-equal to cancer-free. This cannot be the same as the metaphysical claim of God, where lack of belief and God-free are distinct philosophical positions.
But there's a context under which it can be presented as a pejorative, and I'm reminded of a line from The West Wing, as I am almost every day, one of the greatest shows ever, where they suggest calling their opponent spry. Because spry is a word that sounds like a compliment, but it's only used for old people. It's a way of poking at somebody's age with a backhanded compliment without saying you're old, because we're just going to say you're spry.
The pivot to a TV show anecdote and the word spry is an example of a red herring fallacy combined with the antecedent fallacy. He has abandoned the philosophical and technical defense of LackTheism and is resorting to irrelevant personal associations and rhetorical observations.
I lack faith. I lack religion. I lack a belief that a God truly exists. And to suggest that I do not lack those things is to suggest that I am possibly closed-minded and not open to them being true.
OMG, isn't that what you literally just said in the opening of your video? Okay, we have officially argued in a circle. He has gone entirely from defending the logical coherence of his earlier act of rejection and returned to defending his stance as a simple lack of faith or lack of religion, the starting point of the entire discussion. He is now trying to validate his original premise by introducing an emotional appeal. The threat that denying his lack status implies he is closed-minded. Irony here. His own contradictory statement was the most intellectually close statement possible.
That's one of the reasons why I'm willing to say I lack theism, because if theism meets the burden of proof, I will no longer lack it. I will be a theist.
What burden of proof does it have to meet for you to believe? What standard of evidence will you accept? But again, I thought this video was specifically about your lack of belief in theism, not about burden of proof on theism. Can you not talk about one topic consistently? Now, there's another red herring fallacy, and you continue to argue that the burden of proof is only on the theist, where you state that you will only lack belief when theism meets this burden. You have just argued in a circle, and this position is just a restatement of your earlier initial LackTheism premise.
Is a rock an atheist? No. But only because we tend to describe atheist and all the other ists as a person who, and a rock, as far as we know, isn't a person. But a rock is non-theistic and atheistic in the sense that it does not possess a belief in a God, but it couldn't matter any less because it couldn't possibly possess a belief in a God.
Wait, if it has no knowledge, then it wouldn't be atheistic. That doesn't hold up. In order to be an atheist, you have to deny a God proposition. This is a category error, and it is philosophically inaccurate. The comparison of a rock to an atheist commits the logical error of confusing an epistemic state with a state of absolute ignorance. Atheism is a propositional stance. It requires the capacity to understand and deny the claim God exists. A rock is non-theistic, but not atheistic because it lacks the capacity for consciousness, mind, or knowledge. It is simply philosophically inert. One is a philosophical position and the other is a biological fact. That isn't related to the argument again, another red herring fallacy.
What about a baby? These are the two that come up all the time. Is a baby an atheist? Well, just like every other person, a baby's a person. And technically, they start off, as far as we can tell, lacking a belief, because they seem to start off lacking any beliefs.
But they haven't any beliefs about theism or atheism yet, most likely. So how can they really be an atheist? Matt Dillahunty. Babies, whether they are atheist or not, has nothing to do with your state of mind specifically. This confuses an absence caused by a lack of capacity with the conclusion reached through deliberate judgment. A baby is not theistic because it lacks the congenital ability to even comprehend the God proposition, making its philosophical status irrelevant to any adult's considered position. You claimed explicit atheism based on active rejection, which requires consciousness, agency, and a verdict.
But it depends on their cognitive abilities. It's undeniable that at some point after birth, the person is not able to even consider the concept. They don't have the linguistic skills, they don't have a theory of mind, they don't have any of these psychological constructs that would allow them to consider the God proposition.
Wait, OMG, if they couldn't consider the God proposition, how can they consider the atheist proposition? This is a logical absurdity. Atheism is a rejection of the God proposition. If a baby lacks the linguistic skills and psychological constructs necessary to consider the God proposition and capable of considering the atheist proposition, the capacity to be an atheist is epistemologically dependent on the capacity to be a theist. If the knowledge for theism is missing, the knowledge of atheism is also missing. The baby is not an atheist, it is non-congeniate.
And at some point in their life, that probably changes. There are some people with conditions where they're just never going to develop properly. And I had a relative who was similar to that. He only lived to be a couple of years old.
Bro, why are you sharing me your testimony? Got any evidence for it?
But barring that, most people get to a point where they can, in fact, consider the proposition.
You could have just said that earlier without the personal stories and red herring, on top of red herring fallacies. But really, you shouldn't be talking about this at all because this argument so far has been herring. This is another anecdote fallacy here. You are using subjective, personal testimony, whether this is about your family or your favorite TV shows, which is just a distraction.
And so let's just say, for the sake of this argument, that at exactly 4 years old, on the birthday, everyone becomes capable of evaluating the claim that a God exists. Not all of them are presented with a God proposition.
You could have just said everyone becomes capable of evaluating claims in general. You are committing a redundance fallacy by focusing on the arbitrary God proposition, when the core issue is simply cognate capacity. This discussion with the 4-year-old and the specific religious concept is a distraction. If the person has the capacity to evaluate any complex abstract claim, morality, math, science, you could have stated that people must reach a stage of abstract reasoning to engage in the debate, making the long tangent about birthdays and conditions completely at least linked to one of his red herrings. But you have committed so many red herrings that you've probably introduced over 10 new topics or more
in that instant, and some of them have not been presented with a God proposition prior to that for them to reflect on. Which means there comes a time where a person is capable of evaluating a God claim, has not evaluated a God claim, and yet still lacks that claim, does not believe, is the implicit atheist position.
Again, how can you lack a claim if you never investigated the proposition? This is just walking contradictions. Also, this is a fallacy of equivocation. You are now equating the implicit atheism of a child who has never heard the claim, a lack of exposure, with your own explicit atheism, a lack of acceptance after investigation. The implicit atheist the person has not yet exposed is truly lacking a belief. But he claimed to have actively rejected claims, meaning he has already passed a verdict by defining atheism with the default state of a child, which is just wrong.
They meet the definition in technical terms.
Well, apparently they don't if you can't make the definition without contradicting yourself.
Couldn't matter much less at all. But it's worth noting that they lack theism. They may gain theism, or they could remain atheistic.
Wait, gain theism? If someone's an atheist, wouldn't they choose theism? How would they gain it? You confuse the lack of exposure with an active examined belief status. A child who has not encountered the God proposition is simply not theistic, lacking any belief, cannot be an explicit atheist because they lack the cognitive capacity and knowledge required to deny the claim. Another equivocation fallacy to define them from the same. From rocks to babies and other things, there's just more examples of red herrings.
What changes when that happens? Well, they may have a positive belief that the claim some God exists is false, or that it simply does not warrant accepting, and that can change, especially if theism ever meets its burden of proof. Lack can, but does not necessarily imply a negative.
You are now committing an equivocation fallacy by treating lack as a neutral concept when in the context of belief it is always a form of negation. The two possibilities you outlined, developing a positive disbelief, claim is false, or conclude non-acceptance, claim does not warrant accepting, are both conclusions that fall under the umbrella of negation.
I'd rather keep presenting it as a positive. I lack a good reason to believe.
Well, then you are making subjective claims about your mental state.
It lets people know I am open to good reasons to believe.
Well, are you really? How do you know there isn't good reasons to believe?
Being overly guarded about the term LackTheism may, in some situations, come off as closed-minded. It might suggest that you are a hard or strong atheist and proud of it, and that you are not willing to entertain the notion that a theistic claim can be true.
So you're just here for entertainment purposes and don't care for the truth. Oh, I see how it is. This is just a word salad and not an illogical argument.
But that's nothing to be proud of. And by the way, I don't just mean that hard or strong atheism is nothing to be proud of. Neither of them are anything to be ashamed of either. And so like in the sense of we can have a pride festival because people are suggesting we should be shamed.
How does a pride festival have to do with this? Pivot to the pride festival analogy is just another red herring fallacy and just based off your emotions again.
We can be proud of our secularism, of our atheism, in the sense that we are not ashamed of it, but not in the position of the conclusion, because you can be an atheist for incredibly bad reasons.
Thanks for sharing your opinions on why we shouldn't feel ashamed. All of this is a rhetorical retreat. You just went on a bunch of tangents, and you're focusing on the subjective topic of personal pride and shame.
The pride should come from being a reasonable individual, a skeptic. And then only in a limited sense, because I'm not sure how much credit anybody can take for their positions, considering that doxastic volunteerism doesn't seem to be true.
So now we changed the topic to pride?
The notion that you choose your beliefs or anything else. Now, what you seem to be able to do is function and actively ask questions and be considered and be more or less rational.
Bro, so first you argue about pride, then what's rational? What's next? You are justifying your own choice of the term LackTheism on purely subjective grounds. Maybe try to defend your original argument first.
But theism and atheism aren't anything to be proud of in and of themselves. You can be an atheist for bad reasons. You can be a theist for bad reasons. You might have good reasons, maybe, for either of them. I don't know. But having a considered position on the subject doesn't mean that the position is true.
Pride and evaluation of evidence are two completely different things. He is trying to resolve a philosophical problem, evaluation of evidence, but he's appealing to a social and emotional topic, which is pride and shame. This is red herring fallacies, and it's all subjective feeling.
It doesn't mean that it's deserving of respect. It also doesn't mean that it's untrue or deserving of derision. Your belief or lack thereof, belief or lack thereof, is independent from the justification, and it's independent from consideration, and it's independent from truth value.
Dude, quit with the red herrings. By claiming that belief or lack thereof is independent from the justification and truth value, you are committing that fallacy again.
None of us who use the term or the definition think for a second that our position isn't a considered one. We don't think that we lack in a deficient sense.
I would say he's making a generalization fallacy here. He says none of us who use the term think for a second that our position isn't a considered one. Now, I know he didn't say a specific number of people, but he still implied that he was talking about other people, and how does he know what those people actually believe? Which he's basically projecting his own subjective mental state, a considered position, onto all those other people, which is granting his term false authority.
There's a difference between implication and inference. One of them is the speaker is implying something, and the other one is that the listener is inferring something.
This is another red herring fallacy, a meta-linguistic distraction.
And if somebody tries to imply that our lack of theism is a negative, I can correct that. If I merely infer that they mean that it's a negative, they can then correct that because I could be wrong. But none of this implies a deficiency. You infer it.
This is just another red herring fallacy. You are claiming the logical inconsistencies caused by faulty inference, a misunderstanding of the listener's words, rather than your own implication, the logical content of your words.
Because it is sometimes implied, and there's a temptation to take that frequent implication and turn it into a strong inference that may not be justified. You're all free. If you don't like the term, don't use it. But there are people who do, and people who find it honest and accurate. And they're not saying that your atheism isn't a considered position.
The choice of his language is driven by subjective public relations rather than an objective argument that he could make, but he doesn't make. Also, he's defining the term as a matter of personal preference. If you don't like the term, don't use it.
They're not saying that it's not a reasonable one. They're stating a rather, I guess, largely banal and pedantic fact that doesn't seem worth getting upset over, but anybody can get upset over for whatever reason. It can be a pet peeve. I got tons of them. I hate when people say things like very unique. Something's either unique or it's not. Another West Wing reference. But also, I had this view before West Wing, which is one of the reasons I love West Wing so much. Is when President Bartlett said this, I just went, yes, finally, someone.
Now, this one is managing social perceptions over the necessary defense of his own system's internal logic. I swear I have to go over this again.
But I definitely lack theism. I lack a good reason for belief, and I lack the belief itself. I also lack faith, as best I can tell. Faith being the excuse people give for believing things without good reason. Is it possible that I believe things without good reason?
By stating he definitely lacks theism and he lacks faith, he just looped this back to the beginning because that's what his main point was, and he didn't introduce actually any argument. He just restated what he just said and claimed.
Reasons? Yes. But I don't lack faith in the sense that I would say, oh, I have faith in, or anything like that. I also lack an understanding of quantum mechanics. I'm not doing anything at all to fix that. There's too many things to learn, and, I don't have the time. I lack cancer, and I'm happy that I lack cancer, as far as I know. I probably don't lack cancer, but I am unaware. I lack an understanding that I have cancer. I also lack the willpower to stop drinking energy drinks, but I'm working on it. I'm not doing very well at it, but I am definitely working at it. I don't like coffee, and so that becomes my thing.
From lacking an understanding of quantum mechanics to lacking cancer and the willpower to quit energy drinks, this is just an equivocation fallacy. By equating the philosophical lack of God belief with simple, unrelated states of being and subjective facts, this is just multiple more red herring fallacies.
But I do understand that there are folks that view it as an implied pejorative, kind of like spry. But I hope that when I'm 80, I'm spry. I'll pick up that label and run with it, just like I pick up the label of lefty, whatever. Pick a label that somebody tries to use as a pejorative, including LackTheist, if somebody implies that. I'll run with all of them, because I don't think I'd qualify as spry right now. I don't think I'm either old enough or, let's be honest, physically mobile enough to really call me spry. I probably struggle more than some 70-year-olds on some issues.
OMG, another point that is only based on emotional justification.
But I don't think that LackTheism is a real problem. I think it stems from, in many ways, the same sort of pride that people feel when other people suggest they should be ashamed of something. You should be ashamed of being gay. You should be ashamed of being an atheist. And in that sense, that kind of pride is justified. But the real source of pride should be the reasoning that led to both the conclusion.
This is just based on emotional justification.
I am not convinced that the God claim is warranted, and any other reasonable conclusions that come along with it. And if that gets defined or described to someone as lacking belief, it's fine to acknowledge, yes, in fact, I lack that belief, and I'm really happy about it, in the same way that I definitely lack cancer. It's a weird way to describe it, but you don't have to make the inference or support the implication that the pejorative has any teeth at all.
This is another equivocation fallacy because he's defining it the same as biological facts. His language is driven by personal reasons. I'm really happy about it and defends against implied negativity.